March 7th, 1945. The elevated terrain overlooking Remagen, Germany. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Enderman raised his field glasses with hands that shook, not from apprehension, but from sheer astonishment. Through the early afternoon mist, he observed a sight that defied every tactical supposition of the preceding 6 months. The bridge remained standing, a solitary span, the sole crossing. Every German officer, from the Rhine to the Elbe, had received unequivocal directives to obliterate all bridges before Allied forces could reach them. Yet there it stood, the Ludendorff Bridge, its twin stone turrets soaring like testaments to German engineering prowess, its steel arches stretching across the 300 meters of the Rhine River, a natural barrier representing Germany's final line of defense against invasion from the west. Lieutenant Karl Timberman, standing beside Enderman, voiced the thought that would echo through history. We must seize it immediately, before they demolish it. What neither man comprehended in that critical instant was that the capture of this singular structure would initiate the most devastating strategic unraveling in German military history. A psychological dismantling of Nazi defensive doctrine so profound that German commanders would later recount it as the very moment they knew, with absolute certainty, that the war was lost. The mathematical calculations of this pivotal juncture were being inscribed not in the spilled blood of soldiers, but in the stark geometry of strategic planning. The Rhine was more than a mere river. It was a formidable barrier, 300 meters in width, with currents powerful enough to capsize assault boats, depths sufficient to submerge armored vehicles, and banks steep enough to ensnare advancing infantry. Since the era when Roman legions first surveyed its waters, gazing into the Germanic forests, the Rhine had historically served as central Germany's principal bulwark against incursions from the west. In March of 1945, it represented Hitler's last desperate gambit to secure a separate armistice with the Western Allies, or to redeploy divisions from the collapsing Eastern Front for a final stand. The existence of a single, unbreached bridge would shatter that strategic calculus within a mere 10 minutes of engagement. The prelude to catastrophe had been building for months. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final major offensive in the West, had culminated in disaster by the close of January 1945. What German propaganda had hailed as a decisive counterattack had instead depleted the Wehrmacht's last mobile reserves. Approximately 100,000 German casualties, the destruction of 600 tanks, and the irreplaceable attrition of veteran panzer divisions left the German armies west of the Rhine as mere specters of their former might. By early March, 12 American divisions were advancing relentlessly towards the river along a front extending from the Netherlands to Switzerland. The German 15th Army, tasked with defending the critical sector between Cologne and Koblenz, could field barely 50,000 combat-ready troops against a force 5 times its size. The bridge itself bore a poignant irony, perceived by both sides. Named in honor of General Erich Ludendorff, Germany's brilliant but ultimately unsuccessful strategist of the First World War, the structure had been erected between 1916 and 1919, predominantly by Russian prisoners of war. Those prisoners, toiling under brutal conditions, had constructed their bridge too well. Steel trusses engineered to bear the weight of fully loaded military trains. Stone towers at either end, incorporating 3 levels of defensive emplacements. 4 massive stone piers sunk deep into the Rhine's bedrock. The original blueprints included provisions for demolition chambers integrated into the structure itself. Cavities designed to house explosives, enabling the bridge's destruction before it could fall into enemy hands. The French occupation forces following the First World War had filled these cavities with concrete. When Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland in 1936, German engineers had affixed 60 zinc line containers to the bridge's girders, each intended to hold 3 kilograms of explosives. The system was designed for simultaneous detonation, collapsing the entire span into the Rhine within seconds. However, fate and Hitler's deep-seated paranoia had intervened in October of 1944. An American bomb struck the Mülheim Bridge in Cologne, detonating its pre-emplaced demolition charges and destroying the bridge precisely as German forces had intended. Hitler's fury was volcanic. He ordered the immediate court-martial of the officers implicated and mandated the removal and nearby storage of all demolition charges on Rhine bridges. New orders stipulated that charges could only be reinstalled when Allied forces were within 8 kilometers, and bridges could only be destroyed by written authorization from sector commanders. This policy created a harrowing dilemma for German officers. Destroy a bridge prematurely and face a court-martial for obliterating vital retreat routes. Delay too long and risk execution for allowing strategic infrastructure to fall into enemy hands. The psychological pressure engendered a paralysis in German decision-making at the very moment when decisive action was most crucial. The American advance toward Remagen had been christened Operation Lumberjack, a deceptively modest designation for what would become one of the war's most pivotal operations. The primary objectives of this operation were the capture of Cologne and Koblenz, two ancient cities that controlled vital Rhine crossings. The American First Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, advanced eastward through the Eifel region, encountering German resistance that had devolved from organized defense to desperate delaying tactics. The German commanders harbored no illusions about halting the American advance. Their sole orders were to delay, to procure precious time for more troops to withdraw across the Rhine before the bridges were destroyed. Major General John Leonard's 9th Armored Division, nicknamed the Phantom Division because German intelligence repeatedly reported it annihilated only to confront it again days later, spearheaded the American thrust. The morning of March 7th commenced with a pervasive fog blanketing the Rhine Valley. German command and control had devolved into a state of chaos that would have been inconceivable within the Wehrmacht of 1940. General Edwin von Rothkirch, commander of the 53rd Corps, responsible for the Remagen sector, had inadvertently wandered into American lines on March 6th and been captured. His successor, General Richard von Forster, was unable to reach Roland because American units had already severed the roads. At 1 o'clock in the morning on March 7th, General Otto Hitzfeld of the 67th Corps was informed that he now bore responsibility for defending the Ludendorff Bridge, despite being 64 kilometers away and having never personally seen the structure. Hitzfeld promptly dispatched his adjutant, Major Hans Scheller, to assume command of the bridge's defense. Scheller departed at 3 o'clock in the morning with 8 men and a radio, intending to commandeer retreating units to establish a defensive perimeter. The journey devolved into a harrowing ordeal of incorrect turns, American roadblocks, and severe fuel shortages. The radio unit became separated. Scheller did not reach Remagen until 11:15, less than 2 hours before American forces would crest the heights overlooking the town. Captain Willy Breuer, the German commandant actually present at Remagen, commanded a force that existed more in name than in substance. His official strength was listed as 600 men. The actual combat capability consisted of 36 soldiers, most of whom were either wounded, elderly, or young boys from the Volkssturm militia. Many were Ostarbeiter, Soviet prisoners of war, who had accepted service in German uniform to escape prison camps. Their loyalty and effectiveness in combat against Americans were, at best, questionable. Breuer had spent weeks pleading for reinforcements, for proper radio equipment, for anything that might aid him in defending a strategic objective that everyone seemed to have overlooked until the Americans appeared on the horizon. His requests vanished into the disarray of a disintegrating command structure. The demolition charges that should have been permanently installed on the bridge remained stored in a nearby building, awaiting orders for their reinstatement. When those orders finally arrived on March 6th, engineer officers frantically worked to place 2,800 kilograms of explosives in the piers and affix 300 kilograms of shaped charges to critical structural points. The American approach on March 7th possessed an element of serendipitous destiny. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Enderman commanded a task force from the 9th Armored Division's Combat Command B, comprising elements from the 14th Tank Battalion and the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion. Their orders were to secure the town of Remagen and then proceed south to rendezvous with the Third Army. No one anticipated discovering an intact bridge. American intelligence had confirmed that German engineers were methodically destroying every Rhine crossing as Allied forces advanced. Photographers had documented the destruction of bridges at Cologne, Bonn, and Koblenz. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen should have been demolished days earlier. When Enderman's forward elements emerged from the woods overlooking the town at approximately 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the scene that greeted them seemed almost surreal. German military vehicles were still traversing the bridge. Civilians crowded the approaches. The structure stood unblemished, its demolition charges visible as dark masses affixed to the steelwork. Lieutenant Karl Timberman, a 22-year-old platoon leader born in Frankfurt, Germany, in 1922, who had emigrated to the United States with his parents as an infant, would lead the assault. He spoke fluent German and grasped the significance of what they were witnessing better than most. The bridge represented something far more valuable than a mere crossing point. It symbolized the collapse of the last barrier, the final natural obstacle overcome not by a massive assault, but by a confluence of good fortune and German inertia. Brigadier General William Hogg, commander of Combat Command B, arrived at the heights at approximately 2:45. He immediately grasped the strategic implications. This was not simply an opportunity to cross the Rhine, but a chance to leapfrog 3 weeks ahead of Montgomery's meticulously planned Operation Plunder, scheduled for late March. Hoge made the decision that would define his military career. We're taking that bridge now. The German defenders found themselves in the most precarious tactical predicament imaginable. Major Scheller had arrived at the bridge approach just over 2 hours earlier, utterly exhausted from his nightmarish journey and bewildered by what he discovered. Captain Breuer briefed him in mere minutes. The bridge was rigged for demolition, with electrical detonators controlled from the eastern tunnel entrance. A secondary system involved a fuse that could be ignited manually. The defensive perimeter was virtually non-existent. Most of the troops Scheller had expected to rally were already across the bridge or circumventing Remagen entirely. The fog that had shrouded the morning had dissipated at precisely the most inopportune moment, granting American artillery observers perfect visibility. At approximately 3:15 in the afternoon, American tanks materialized at the western approach to the town. The time for deliberation had evaporated. The assault on Remagen itself took less than 30 minutes. Lieutenant John Grimball's platoon of M26 Pershing tanks, the newest and most potent American tanks in the European theater, spearheaded the advance. The Pershings were so novel that most German troops had never encountered them. Armed with 90mm guns capable of penetrating any German armor, they represented yet another symbol of American industrial supremacy. The tanks fired white phosphorus rounds to generate smoke screens and bombarded German positions with high-explosive shells. Timberman's infantry followed, advancing through streets bearing the indelible scars of years of Allied bombing. Remagen had been a picturesque Rhine resort town before the war. By March of 1945, more than half its structures lay in ruins. The few German soldiers attempting to defend the town fell back rapidly. Most simply fled across the bridge. Captain Breuer, observing the American advance from his position near the bridge's western tower, knew the moment had arrived. At 3:20, he gave the order to detonate the western approach ramp. The explosion created a crater 3 meters wide, preventing American tanks from driving directly onto the bridge, but the main structure remained intact. The race for the bridge became a contest measured in minutes and meters. American tanks positioned themselves at the western end, their 90mm guns hammering German emplacements on the eastern heights. The Eralt, a 180-meter basalt cliff rising on the eastern bank, bristled with German anti-aircraft guns that now depressed their barrels to engage American troops directly. Timberman's infantry, approximately 120 men from A Company, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, commenced their crossing of the bridge at approximately 3:50. They advanced in short, rapid bursts, utilizing the bridge's stone towers and railings for cover. German machine guns unleashed a torrent of fire from the eastern towers and from positions within the tunnel mouth beyond. Bullets ricocheted off steel and stone, creating a deadly crossfire. Several Americans fell in the initial seconds, but the rest pressed onward. Major Scheller, observing from the tunnel entrance on the eastern side, faced the most consequential decision any German officer would make that day. The bridge was laden with explosives. The electrical detonation system was primed. American troops were halfway across. Every instinct, every tenet of military doctrine demanded he detonate the bridge immediately. But Lieutenant Karl Peters of the anti-aircraft artillery had approached him minutes earlier with a desperate plea. Peters commanded a battery equipped with the new Henschel HS-297 rocket launcher system, a top-secret weapon capable of firing 24 high-velocity anti-aircraft rockets with unprecedented accuracy. The battery was still on the western side of the bridge. Peters could not countenance the possibility of this advanced technology falling into American hands. Scheller agreed to delay. This decision would cost him his life. Captain Karl Friesenhahn, the combat engineer responsible for the demolition charges, positioned himself at the electrical detonator within the tunnel mouth. When Peters' battery finally cleared the bridge, Friesenhahn received the order from Scheller. At approximately 4 o'clock, with American troops 2/3 of the way across, Friesenhahn turned the key. Nothing happened. The electrical system had failed. A stray shell had likely severed the wiring earlier, though the precise cause would never be definitively determined. Sergeant Alex Drabick, a 34-year-old from Toledo, Ohio, became the first American soldier to set foot on the eastern bank of the Rhine since Napoleon's armies had crossed in the opposite direction over a century prior. Behind him, timbermen and the remainder of a company continued their advance. Engineer Sergeant Eugene Dorland and his team began systematically cutting every wire they could locate, racing against time to disconnect the remaining demolition charges before German engineers could activate the backup system. Corporal Anton Faust, a German engineer, volunteered for a perilous mission. He sprinted from the tunnel, dashed approximately 100 meters under direct fire, and ignited the backup fuse by hand. The explosion that ensued at approximately 4:15 sent shockwaves through the structure. The bridge lifted several inches from its foundations, then settled back. Smoke and debris filled the air. American soldiers on the bridge were thrown to the ground, but when the smoke cleared, the structure remained standing. The main steel arches had sustained damage but remained intact. The 6-inch sag in the roadway was traversable. The bridge held. The race was over. The Americans had prevailed. The immediate aftermath was a scene of controlled chaos, managed by rigorous training and unwavering determination. American combat engineers swarmed onto the bridge, working with frantic urgency to disarm the remaining demolition charges and repair the damage to the approach ramp. Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Fraser's 27th Armored Infantry Battalion began establishing a defensive perimeter on the eastern side, expanding outward from the tunnel entrance across the slopes of the Erelt. German resistance crumbled with astonishing swiftness. Captain Breuer and most of his remaining troops took refuge in the 400-meter railroad tunnel that burrowed beneath the Erelt. By 5:30 in the evening, Lieutenant Timberman and his men had secured the tunnel entrance and captured several hundred prisoners, most of whom expressed profound relief that their war was at an end. Major Scheller made a fatal decision born of desperation. Recognizing that the bridge was lost and that he bore formal responsibility for its defense, he commandeered a bicycle and rode east in search of his corps' headquarters to explain the unfolding events. He would be apprehended 4 days later, court-martialed, and executed by firing squad, serving as a scapegoat for a failure that had numerous architects. News of the bridge's capture rocketed up the American chain of command with the speed of an electrical current. At approximately 5 o'clock, Brigadier General Hoger radioed his division commander, Major General John Leonard, with words that were both astonishing and miraculous. "We've got the bridge." Leonard immediately relayed the intelligence to 1st Army headquarters. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was conferring with his staff when the call came through. According to witnesses, Hodges seized the telephone with such haste that he knocked over his coffee. Within minutes, he was on the line with 12th Army Group Commander General Omar Bradley. Bradley was in a meeting with his operations officer, Major General Harold Bull, when an aide interrupted with an urgent call. "Brad, we've got a bridge," Hodges declared, his voice vibrating with excitement. "A bridge? You mean you've secured one intact on the Rhine?" Bradley inquired, rising from his desk. "Yep," Leonard confirmed. "Nabbed one at Remagen before they could blow it up." Bradley's response became legendary among the American High Command. "Hot dog, Courtney. This is going to bust them wide open. Are you getting your stuff across?" "Just as fast as we can push it over," Hodges replied. Bradley immediately contacted Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower at his headquarters in Reims, France. Eisenhower grasped the magnitude of the situation instantly. The capture represented what he would later describe as one of those rare and fleeting opportunities that occasionally arise in war and which, if grasped, have incalculable effects on determining future success. Eisenhower's original plan had designated Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group to execute the primary Rhine crossing near Wesel in late March, supported by elaborate airborne operations and massive artillery preparations. The American crossing was intended to be secondary, smaller in scale, and meticulously coordinated. The Remagen Bridge altered everything. Eisenhower ordered Bradley to exploit the bridgehead immediately. Every available unit was to be diverted to Remagen. The strategic focus of the entire Western Front shifted southward within a matter of hours. The German reaction was a grim testament to command paralysis and murderous scapegoating. When news reached Adolf Hitler at his headquarters in Berlin, his response was a confluence of strategic despair and homicidal rage. Hitler had been clinging to increasingly delusional hopes that the Rhine would grant him the leverage to negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies. The entire German defensive strategy in the West hinged on utilizing the river as a barrier behind which shattered divisions could be reconstituted and redeployed. An intact American bridgehead, 3 weeks ahead of schedule, demolished that strategy. Hitler's immediate reaction was to identify a culprit and execute them. He summoned Lieutenant General Rudolf Hübner, a fanatical Nazi known for his ruthlessness on the Eastern Front. Hübner was bestowed command of a mobile special court-martial with orders to try and execute the officers responsible for losing the bridge. The court-martial would be a legal charade, a traveling execution squad with judicial pretenses. Hübner was attended by 2 lieutenant colonels and 2 military police officers, acting as the execution detail. None of the supervising officers possessed legal expertise. Hübner deliberately refused offers of the German military justice code, asserting that only Hitler's direct order served as his requisite authorization. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the distinguished commander of all German forces in the Western Theater, was removed from his command on March the 10th. Hitler's pervasive suspicion demanded a sacrificial figure of commensurate standing. Rundstedt was succeeded by Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who was hastily redeployed from his leadership of German troops in Italy. Kesselring was a competent defensive strategist, recognized by Hitler as his firefighter for his skill in stabilizing collapsing situations. However, even Kesselring immediately grasped that the predicament at Remagen was beyond retrieval. He subsequently characterized the loss of the bridge as the crime of Remagen, stating it had fractured the front along the Rhine and rendered any prolonged defense untenable. Hermann Göring, in charge of the rapidly disintegrating Luftwaffe, offered a more stark evaluation. The seizure of the bridge, he remarked, rendered a protracted defense impossible. The psychological fallout transcended mere words. German officers, who had harbored some optimism about holding the Rhine, now understood the war was irrevocably entering its concluding phase. The flying court-martial commenced its operations with brutal efficiency. General Major Richard von Bothmer, who held nominal command of the Bonn and Remagen sector, despite never reaching the bridge itself, faced trial on March 9th. He was found guilty of dereliction of duty, reduced to the rank of private, and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment. Von Bothmer, whose wife had passed away and whose son had perished in the conflict, seized a pistol from a court official and took his own life within the courtroom on March 10th. On March 11th, the court-martial convened at the headquarters of Field Marshal Model's Army Group B. 4 officers were prosecuted that day in proceedings that each concluded in under an hour. Major Hans Scheller was convicted of failing to demolish the bridge, despite arriving only 2 hours prior to the American assault and having exerted maximum effort under insurmountable constraints. Lieutenant Carl Peters was convicted of allowing his concealed rocket launchers to fall into American possession, notwithstanding his plea for additional time to evacuate his equipment. Major August Kraft and Major Herbert Strobel, combat engineers who had emplaced the original demolition charges days earlier and were 60 kilometers distant when the bridge was captured, were convicted of inadequate preparation of the demolition system. All 4 men received death sentences. The executions were carried out on March 14, 1945, in wooded areas near the small hamlets of Rimbach and Oberersson. The 4 officers were led into the woods, compelled to kneel, and shot in the back of the neck. They were interred in shallow, unmarked graves where they fell. Captain Willy Brand, who had actually overseen the bridge's defense and had contributed more than anyone to preparing its destruction, was tried in absentia and likewise condemned to death. However, Brand was already a prisoner of the Americans, having been captured in a tunnel on March 7th. Captain Carl Fitzhenry, the engineer who had actually attempted to detonate the charges, was also in American custody. Fitzhenry was tried in absentia and acquitted, a rare instance of judicial reason within the proceedings. Field Marshal Model personally sanctioned the executions and ordered that news of them be disseminated to every unit in the German armed forces as a deterrent. The message was unambiguous. Failure would be met with death, regardless of the prevailing circumstances. While German officers were being executed for the loss of the bridge, American forces were surging across it in ever-increasing numbers. The bridge itself remained intact, albeit visibly damaged. Engineers worked around the clock to reinforce weakened sections and repair the approach ramp. A combat engineer battalion installed lighting for nighttime transit. Military police managed the flow of personnel and material. Within 24 hours of its capture, over 8,000 American troops had advanced into the bridgehead on the eastern bank. Tank units, artillery batteries, and infantry battalions all streamed across the sole functional Rhine bridge between Switzerland and the North Sea. Yet the Americans were acutely aware that the bridge could fail at any moment. Combat engineers commenced construction of tactical bridges immediately. By March 9th, 48 hours after the bridge's seizure, the initial tactical bridge was completed. This was an M1940 aluminum alloy treadway bridge, erected directly north of the Ludendorff Bridge. Preparations for a second pontoon bridge began without delay. The American objective was to solidify the bridgehead irrevocably, irrespective of the fate of the original structure. The German response to the establishment of the bridgehead comprised the entirety of Hitler's strategic reserves, which by March 1945 meant a disparate collection of ad hoc combat groups assembled from depleted divisions and rear echelon formations. The Luftwaffe, by then a mere shadow of its former might, launched repeated aerial assaults against the bridge. Over the ensuing 10 days, American intelligence documented 367 distinct German air sorties targeting the Remagen vicinity. The Americans countered by assembling the largest concentration of anti-aircraft artillery in the European theater. 5 anti-aircraft battalions, equipped with hundreds of guns, established a defensive cordon around the bridge. The aerial engagements became some of the most intense of the entire conflict. American gunners claimed to have downed over 100 German aircraft in the 10 days following the bridge's capture. The Germans deployed their most advanced technology in desperate attempts to obliterate the bridge. Arado R, 234 jet bombers, the world's initial operational jet bombers, executed diving attacks exceeding 800 kilometers per hour. These jets were virtually impossible to intercept, but their bomb accuracy at high velocities was poor, resulting in most of their ordnance missing the bridge. The Germans also deployed the Messerschmitt M262, the world's first operational jet fighter. These aircraft, faster than any Allied counterpart, represented the apex of German technological innovation. However, technology proved insufficient to surmount the fundamental challenges. There were too few aircraft, critically insufficient fuel, and a dearth of experienced pilots. The German air assaults inflicted casualties and damage, but failed to destroy either the original bridge or the tactical bridges being erected in conjunction with it. Hitler personally authorized the deployment of V-2 rockets against the bridge. Marking the singular occasion these strategic weapons were employed against a tactical objective. The V-2, a ballistic missile capable of speeds exceeding 5,000 kilometers per hour, was designed for terrorizing London, not for precision military targeting. 11 V-2 rockets were launched at Remagen from launch sites in the Netherlands, approximately 130 kilometers distant. The rockets claimed the lives of a handful of American soldiers and an unquantified number of German civilians in nearby communities. Not a single one struck the bridge. The Germans dispatched frogmen down the Rhine. 7 naval demolition specialists, equipped with Italian-manufactured underwater breathing apparatus, undertook the mission. The Americans detected their presence using canal defense lights, a clandestine technology that projected intense beams across the water's surface. All 7 frogmen were either killed or apprehended. The Germans unleashed explosively laden boats down the river, deployed mines disguised as logs, and even utilized the Goliath, tracked remotely controlled vehicle, and the Karl railway artillery, a 600mm super-heavy siege mortar firing shells weighing over 2 tons. The Karl was among the largest artillery pieces ever constructed. Its projectiles could demolish fortifications with a single impact, but the weapon's precision was limited, and its deployment required days. The few shells that were fired at the bridge missed their mark. The psychological effect of these concerted German efforts produced the opposite outcome intended by Hitler. Each unsuccessful assault on the bridge bolstered American morale while highlighting German desperation. American soldiers engaged in combat within the bridgehead understood they were witnessing the final struggles of the Wehrmacht. German soldiers recognized this as well. Prisoners captured in the fighting around the bridgehead expressed relief that their war was concluded. Many had anticipated orders for a counterattack on the bridge, directives they knew would constitute suicide missions. The American presence across the Rhine eradicated any lingering hope that Germany could avert total defeat. The strategic calculations were starkly straightforward. With American forces already firmly established across the Rhine, the river had ceased to function as a viable defensive barrier. Every German division allocated to contain the Remagen bridgehead was a division unavailable to defend against the substantial Allied crossing operations planned for late March. The German defensive line was being strained to its breaking point by forces it could no longer contain. Major General Karl Wagner, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Walter Model, later provided the most succinct German assessment of Remagen's strategic implications. The capture of the bridge signified the conclusion of the war for Germany. Wagner stated in post-war interrogations, "The Remagen incident engendered profound feelings of guilt and shame within the German command. It demonstrated that the Allies now possessed complete initiative, and German forces could only react, never seize the advantage." The failure to destroy the bridge symbolized the complete disintegration of German command and control, the inability to execute even elementary military operations, particularly for German officers trained in the Prussian tradition of military excellence. This failure resonated deeply. It represented not merely a tactical defeat, but a moral collapse. It was definitive proof that the Wehrmacht, which had conquered Europe in 1940, had dissolved beyond recognition. The bridge collapsed on March 17th at approximately 3 in the afternoon. The structure had endured for 10 days under conditions no engineer had ever anticipated. American traffic had been incessant, with thousands of vehicles crossing and recrossing. German artillery had scored direct hits and near misses. Aerial bombardments had inflicted cumulative damage. The vibrations from nearby detonations had stressed metal fatigued by decades of service and the failed German demolition attempt on March 7th. Witnesses recounted hearing rivets popping like gunfire in the minutes preceding the collapse. A vertical hanger on the southern arch snapped, followed by another. The entire central span lifted momentarily, then plunged into the Rhine with a roar audible for kilometers. 28 American combat engineers perished in the collapse, with over 60 injured. Most were members of the 276th Engineer Combat Battalion who had been engaged in repair work at the moment of failure. The irony was grim. The very men who had secured the bridge through their desperate efforts to disarm German demolition charges now perished because their repairs could not counteract the accumulated damage. However, by the time the bridge fell, it had become strategically inconsequential. American combat engineers had completed 2 tactical bridges and were finishing a third. Pontoon bridges, treadway bridges, and Bailey bridges now spanned the Rhine at multiple locations near Remagen. Over 25,000 American troops had crossed the damaged Ludendorff Bridge before its collapse. Following its demise, the rate of transit actually increased, as the tactical bridges could accommodate heavier traffic. By March 25th, 18 days after the bridge's initial capture, over 125,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine at Remagen. 6 entire divisions, complete with their tanks, artillery, and supply trains, had established themselves east of the river. The bridgehead extended 8 miles deep and 25 miles wide. It encompassed 11 kilometers of the vital autobahn connecting the Ruhr industrial region with Frankfurt. American forces were strategically positioned to advance deep into central Germany. The breakout from the Remagen bridgehead commenced on March 25th. American armored divisions, previously constrained by the narrow bridgehead perimeter, surged eastward with unprecedented speed. Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division covered 108 kilometers in a single day. Combat Command A advanced 110 kilometers in 11 hours. German resistance, which had been resolute within the confined area around the bridge, dissipated across the broader front. Entire German units surrendered rather than face annihilation. On March the 29th, Combat Command A captured over 200 prisoners in a single engagement. The American advance was so rapid that German commanders lost track of their own formations. Field Marshal Model's Army Group B, which had comprised approximately 325,000 men prior to the Remagen breakout, began to disintegrate. Divisions lost contact with central headquarters. Corps lost contact with army commands. The command structure that had sustained the Wehrmacht through 5 years of war was unraveling. The strategic ramifications cascaded through the German defensive system. Field Marshal Model found himself commanding an army group attempting simultaneously to defend against the Remagen bridgehead, contain American forces breaking out from other Rhine crossings, and prevent the encirclement of the Ruhr industrial region. All 3 objectives were unattainable with the available forces. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland and the source of 80% of its coal and steel production, was on the verge of being cut off. Model understood that losing the Ruhr meant forfeiting any possibility of sustained war production. Without coal and steel, the Wehrmacht could not replace losses, could not fuel its vehicles, and could not manufacture ammunition. The loss of the Remagen Bridge had created the conditions for the loss of the Ruhr. The loss of the Ruhr signified the end of the war. By March 31st, 3 weeks after the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge, all 4 American armies operating on the Western Front had crossed the Rhine. The crossing, which Allied planners had anticipated would necessitate elaborate amphibious operations, substantial casualties, and weeks of combat, had been accomplished with astonishing swiftness. The Rhine, which had repelled Roman legions and served as Germany's western bulwark for 2 millennia, had been breached at multiple points in less than a month. Eisenhower's assessment captured the magnitude of this accomplishment. "We were across the Rhine on a permanent bridge," he wrote in his memoirs. "The traditional defensive barrier to the heart of Germany was pierced. The final defeat of the enemy, which we had long calculated would be accomplished in the spring and summer campaigning of 1945, was suddenly now in our minds, just around the corner. The American assessment was echoed by observers from other nations. War correspondents declared that the war had been shortened by months. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, whose meticulously planned Operation Plunder Rhine crossing had been overshadowed by the American success at Remagen, acknowledged its strategic significance. Soviet commanders, observing the rapid Allied advance from the east, accelerated their own operations to ensure they reached Berlin first. The race for Germany had transformed into a sprint, and the starting gun had been fired at Remagen. German military authorities offered varying estimates of how much the bridge's loss had shortened the war. Some suggested weeks, others months. The reality was that precise calculations were impossible, as the strategic effects were systemic rather than linear. The bridge's capture had not merely advanced the Allied timetable but had fundamentally altered German strategic options. Prior to Remagen, German commanders had envisioned holding the Rhine through April and potentially into May, utilizing that time to reinforce defenses around Berlin and negotiate a separate peace with the Western Allies to concentrate forces against the Soviets. After Remagen, such calculations became illusory. The Rhine had fallen 3 weeks ahead of schedule. German reserves that should have been deployed to counter Montgomery's crossing in the north had been depleted in futile attempts to neutralize the Remagen bridgehead. The psychological impact on German troops was incalculable but devastating. Colonel F. Russell Lyons, the 3rd Corps engineer whose men had captured and held the bridge, estimated that the presence of an intact bridge saved the Allies 2 months of fighting and 35,000 casualties. This calculation was based on a comparison of the Remagen crossing with the amphibious operations required at other Rhine crossing sites. At Wesel, where Montgomery's Operation Plunder unfolded, the British and Americans amassed over 200 artillery pieces, conducted elaborate airborne assaults, and sustained significant casualties despite overwhelming superiority. At Remagen, American forces had crossed with minimal casualties because the bridge eliminated the need for assault boats, the most vulnerable element of any river crossing. Historian Ken Heckler, who conducted extensive post-war interviews with participants from both sides, concluded that the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge materially hastened the war's conclusion. Other historians proposed that the capture shortened the war by approximately 6 months. The variations in estimates reflected differing methodologies and assumptions, but the consensus was clear. Remagen had been a turning point. The human cost of the bridge's capture and defense provides another measure of its significance. American casualties in the Battle of Remagen and the subsequent fighting in the bridgehead totaled approximately 860 killed, with nearly 5,700 wounded and an approximately equal number missing. These were substantial losses, but they were concentrated in the initial 18 days of fighting, from March 7th to March 25th. German casualties during the same period exceeded 11,700 prisoners alone, with killed and wounded figures that were never precisely tallied, but certainly exceeded 10,000. This disparity reflected the fundamental imbalance of forces. The Americans possessed air superiority, artillery superiority, armored superiority, and the psychological advantage of knowing they were winning. The Germans faced orders for counterattacks they could not fulfill, equipment that was failing, and the growing certainty that the war was lost. The executions of the German officers held responsible for losing the bridge cast a dark shadow over the military's honor code. Major Hans Scheller was a 31-year-old career officer who had served with distinction on both the Eastern and Western fronts. He was married and had young children whom he would never see grow up. His transgression had been arriving at the bridge 2 hours before its capture and failing to perform a miracle with 36 exhausted soldiers against several thousand Americans supported by tanks and artillery. Lieutenant Carl Peters was a technical specialist attempting to safeguard classified equipment from capture. His execution occurred despite testimony indicating he had acted in accordance with standing orders to preserve advanced technology. Majors Kraft and Strobel had been following standard procedures for preparing demolition charges. None of the four men deserved death. All four were scapegoats for a system that had collapsed from the top. After the war, Generaloberst Rudolf Hübner, who had presided over the flying court-martial, was tried by German courts and sentenced to 4 years' imprisonment for his complicity in the unlawful executions. It was a lenient sentence for judicial murder, but it established that even in Germany's darkest hour, some officers recognized the trials as a sham. The ultimate assessment of Remagen's significance must encompass its role in the Allied strategic debate concerning the war's conclusion. Before Remagen, there had been serious discussions about whether to halt at the Rhine and allow the Soviets to bear the brunt of the final assault on Germany. Some British and American planners argued that crossing the Rhine would be costly, and Soviet forces advancing from the east could achieve the same objective with fewer Western casualties. Remagen rendered that debate moot. With American military personnel already on the other side of the Rhine River and widening their foothold, stopping would have been strategically unsound. It was imperative to sustain the rapid advance. This decision was validated by the swift progression from the Rhine to the Elbe River, a feat accomplished in slightly more than a month. American troops encountered Soviet forces at Toga on April the 25th, effectively bisecting Germany. By May 8th, Germany had formally capitulated without conditions. The seizure of the bridge had ramifications extending beyond the immediate military landscape. In the United States, news of the bridge's capture reached the Senate while it was in session. The presiding officers temporarily set aside the standing order prohibiting applause, and the senators rose to their feet, offering a heartfelt ovation. Newspapers throughout America featured prominent headlines announcing that the conclusion of hostilities in Europe was imminent. Sales of war bonds experienced a significant surge. The psychological impact on the morale of the American public was profound. After enduring years of conflict and sustaining tens of thousands of casualties, victory was finally palpable and within reach. In Germany, word of the bridge's loss circulated through both the military ranks and the civilian populace, fostering a deep sense of discouragement. German citizens had been assured by their government's propaganda that the Rhine was an impenetrable barrier and that the Allied forces would exhaust themselves against its formidable defenses. The realization that the Rhine had been breached with relative ease and that a single bridge had remained intact due to a confluence of American fortune and German disorganization eroded whatever remained of their confidence in the regime's capabilities. The physical remnants of the Ludendorff Bridge stand as silent witnesses to its history. Following the war, the structure was not reconstructed. The mangled steel and shattered masonry were removed from the Rhine, yet the bridge towers on either bank were left standing. The western towers were eventually repurposed as a museum dedicated to peace. The Friedens Museum Brücke von Remagen. The exhibits within the museum chronicle the bridge's construction and its subsequent demolition, with particular emphasis placed on the fierce Battle of March 1945 and its far-reaching consequences. The eastern towers, located on the opposite bank, now function as a venue for performing arts. The intentional juxtaposition of their wartime function and their current peaceful application serves as a symbolic statement, illustrating that devastation can indeed give way to renewal. The soldiers responsible for capturing the bridge received commendations commensurate with the magnitude of their accomplishment. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann was bestowed the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for acts of extreme bravery. Sergeant Alex Drabik was similarly honored with the same award. Numerous other soldiers from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion and the 14th Tank Battalion were awarded Silver Stars and Bronze Stars. Brigadier General William Hoger was elevated in rank and subsequently assumed command of a corps. The entirety of the 9th Armored Division was presented with a Presidential Unit Citation in recognition of their valorous actions at Remagen. These accolades acknowledged individual and collective valor, but they could not fully encapsulate the immense significance of what had been achieved. The men who traversed the bridge under heavy fire had accomplished more than just securing a tactical objective. They had participated in a pivotal moment that irrevocably altered the course of the war. Every day that the war was shortened translated into the saving of thousands of lives, both military and civilian. The soldiers who fought at Remagen directly contributed to this vital outcome. The narrative of Remagen prompts profound contemplation regarding the role of chance in historical events. Had the fog not dissipated at that precise juncture, would American scouts have spotted the bridge before its demolition? If the electrical detonation mechanism had functioned as intended, would the bridge have been obliterated with American forces still upon it? Had Major Scheller arrived 2 hours earlier, would he have possessed sufficient time to marshal a defense capable of impeding the American advance? If Hitler had not ordered the removal of explosives following the incident at Cologne, would the demolition charges at Remagen have been correctly installed and operational? Each of these hypothetical scenarios suggests an alternative outcome, a history wherein the bridge was destroyed and the Rhine crossing proceeded according to the original Allied timeline. The accumulation of unforeseen circumstances that led to the bridge's capture implies that history is not predetermined, and that individual choices and random occurrences can lead to consequences far exceeding initial expectations. The ultimate evaluation must return to the human element. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was the product of individuals operating under conditions of exceptional stress and peril. Lieutenant Timmerman leading his company across a bridge that could have detonated at any moment. Sergeant Drabik sprinting towards the eastern bank under a hail of German machine gun fire. The combat engineers who toiled under enemy fire to neutralize demolition charges. The tank crews who provided crucial suppressing fire from the western bank. The staff officers who recognized the opportunity and made the decisive choice to exploit it. The commanders who rerouted entire armies to capitalize on the breakthrough. Every individual within this chain of command made choices that contributed to the final result. The absence of any single element might have led to a different outcome. This acknowledgement of individual agency within the larger currents of history is what imbues the story with its compelling nature. The men at Remagen were not mere pawns of historical inevitability. They were active participants who shaped events through their bravery and resolve. The 80th anniversary of the bridge's capture, in March 2025, was commemorated with ceremonies held in both Remagen and the United States. Veteran organizations, historical societies, and military units tracing their lineage to the 9th Armored Division participated in events honoring the soldiers who fought there. The German government acknowledged the battle's significance while simultaneously underscoring the profound lessons learned regarding the devastating costs of war and the invaluable importance of peace. The commemorations served as a reflection of the event's complex legacy. For Americans, it represented a moment of triumph, a validation of courage and decisive leadership. For Germans, it served as a somber reminder of defeat, yet also of liberation from Nazi tyranny. For historians, it provided a compelling case study in the interplay between contingency and determinism in warfare. For all involved, it was a stark reminder that individual decisions made during moments of crisis possess the power to shape the course of human events. The soldiers who captured the bridge at Remagen could not have foreseen that their actions would become the subject of numerous books, films, and scholarly analyses. They were soldiers fulfilling their duty under circumstances none of them would have willingly chosen. That their commitment led to outcomes of world historical significance stands as a testament to the unpredictable nature of warfare and the enduring value of human courage.